Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin, and this time the Russia under Yeltsin and Putin playlist. Today, at the beginning of New Year, I'd like to take a historical perspective on what's going on in Russian-American relations, and especially in view of the coming presidency of Trump. Um, Donald Trump. What struck me, what got my thoughts going about this issue is that Trump says and keeps saying, if I were president, Putin would not have dared to start this. It would not have happened had I been president. Now, the implication of this reasoning is that he is so strong and the America would have been so strong that Russia wouldn't have dared, Putin wouldn't have dared. In other words, in this kind of reasoning, Russia is portrayed as an aggressor. And that is exactly the narrative of the neoconservatives that has been in place for many, many years. The reasoning is that Russia is an aggressor and that Putin is scared or would have been scared and now probably scared and wouldn't dare to do anything that Trump doesn't like. Now, there's something fundamentally wrong with this narrative and with this perspective, and the purpose today is to explain what it is that is wrong. And the title of today's presentation, my dear friends, is American Attempt to Subvert Russia That Failed. Let me start from the very beginning, and that is 1990s. The fact, of course, is that the way American elites perceived Russia in the 1990s is fundamentally different from the way the Russians perceived the United States in the 1990s. Now, the Russians perceived the United States as a friend now. The whole point was that the Russian elites were so profoundly pro-Western. They kept their money in the West. Their children studied in Western schools. They bought apartments in London, especially in London, but also in various places in the West, in Miami, in the south of France. Russian public opinion was totally and profoundly pro-Western. It was like what I call it in my book, the triumph of the Westernizers. This was the atmosphere of the 1990s. Russian foreign policy was completely attuned to being with the West, like the West, totally a part of the West. Now, the Americans actually perceived Russia quite differently, and I was very much involved in this at that time because I testified before the House Banking Committee in 1998 about the Bank of New York scandal. The scandal was basically that most of Russian elites and people around Yeltsin were keeping their money in America, and specifically in the Bank of New York. And the whole scandal revealed this web of corruption and money laundering and moving money overseas, which is I put in the description an article I wrote, Making Money, Keeping Money, Parking Money in the West. So that's the thing. The Western elites, or specifically in the United States, perceived Russia as a defeated country. We won the Cold War. That was the attitude. And therefore, Russia had to be treated as a defeated country. They lost. We won. The Cold War now is over, and that means because we won. That was the attitude, the dominant attitude in the West. And that means that Russia had to pay the price after it won. And that means that it had to lose its colonies and its dependent states. So the absolutely open reasoning was, what was yours now will be ours. And that is why in 1997, when Russia was no threat to anyone whatsoever, when it had a Yeltsin government and the so-called Dream Team at that time it was called, with Nemtsov, the future oppositionist to Putin. This was the government that is as pro-Western as can be. And in fact, there was some talk of Russia applying to NATO as well. This is the government that Russia had. And what did the United States do? It expanded NATO. Moreover, the plans to expand it were made even before 1996, and they postponed it so that Yeltsin could win re-election, which he actually didn't, but that's a separate story. It was falsified. Now, this 1997 expansion of NATO shows very, very well that American elites perceived Russia as a defeated country that had to do what it was told to do. And the Russians could do nothing about it. Their economy was in collapse, their elites were corrupt and stealing money. The oligarchs were lining their pockets with stolen assets. The country was absolutely in the reign of poverty, crime, and I described it very many times in previous videos and in my book as well. So what did Bush do, the next president of the United States? He calls Putin a friend. And at the same time, there's a new expansion of NATO. But this time, it is the Baltic countries, which were a part of the Soviet Union, and which Russia said many, many times that former republics of the Soviet Union should not be admitted into NATO. Now let's make them neutral, like Finland or like Austria. No, 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 no. The Western attitude was what was yours is going to be ours. And that means that the Baltic countries will be become a part of NATO. Russia could do nothing and they swallowed it, but this was the first time that there were beginnings of a change of tone in Russian elites, and Putin was already a president that began to think, if this things the way they go, this is going to be a matter unacceptable to us. And that comes to the 2008 crucial year, because there were three important events. Number one is that there was a decision to make plans were made to include Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. This was a turning point. Now, this was totally unacceptable to Russia, and Putin said it very clearly. Even a year before, in 2007, in his famous speech to the Munich Security Conference, he criticized the United States in no uncertain terms as an expansionist power that is using the opportunity to build its empire at the expense of interests of other countries, including Russia. So in 2008, Russia is accused of aggression against Georgia. This is one of the neocons' narratives, Russian aggression against Georgia. In fact, it was not that at all. What happened was the President Saakashvili, who is now persona non grata, including in Georgia, he decided to conquer back Abkhazia that separated from Georgia in 1991 and South Ossetia. Because North Ossetia was a part of the Russian Federation. So he started this war thinking that Russia was too weak, that it wouldn't dare, that the NATO is supporting it, etc., etc. Well, it didn't work out this way, and the Russian armies moved on and freed South Ossetia from Georgian troops. Now, the important thing is that about this war is that Russian troops could have gone on all the way to Tbilisi if they wanted to, but they didn't. Putin still wanted to make a signal to the West that it's not an expansionist power, that Russia is happy with the status quo as long as NATO doesn't expand and abandons its plans to include Georgia and Ukraine. But the West didn't. So we follow the story of Western attitudes, the US elite's attitude to Russia, was that the Georgian episode make them even more determined to continue the expansion of NATO, and especially the sights were now on Ukraine. Now, it's a very long and complex story of Ukrainian domestic affairs, but the point is that the nationalists got an upper hand in the revolution of 2014, which started out actually as a protest against corruption, as against the embezzlement and all kinds of things that were going on in Ukraine just as much as they were going on in Russia, especially in earlier years. So now the United States demonstrated to Putin what was yours is going to be ours. And there began a process of endless trips of Ukrainian leaders to Washington, and Secretary of States coming to Kiev. In other words, Kiev began to be a hub of American activity in Ukraine, with more and more projects going on, and the Russians were in awe, trying to see how to react. And again, Putin put the brakes on some of the more hotheads who wanted to fight it right there and then. And it was only after the referendum in Crimea that he agreed to accept Crimea, but he didn't support the similar referendum in Donbass, and instead opted for a Minsk Accords, a compromise. And that shows one more time that Putin wanted to keep good relations, especially with Angela Merkel and Germany, and tried to find a compromise not to break completely relations with the West. But that was not good enough for the United States, and the United States neocon policy was to continue to isolate Russia, to chop off piece by piece from its former, what was called empire, and Ukraine was a cornerstone. Russia without Ukraine was believed to be totally weak. It wouldn't continue to be, it would never be able to rise to challenge the United States. That's why Ukraine was crucial to be an American project. And so they started the process from 2014 to 2022. What my good friend and former teacher and friend and the teacher, Stephen Cohen, he wrote a book back in 2018, I think, War with Russia. This was at a time when this was not something in vogue to talk about war with Russia, but what he identified were the trends in the American establishment which were leading to a war with Russia. And that was basically the US policy in Ukraine. The policies were to integrate Ukraine into the Western security arrangements without making it a de facto member of NATO, without actually pronouncing it or declaring it officially. So what happened was that there was more and more American presence in Ukraine in all spheres, including creating secret CIA labs, which Russians are collecting now a lot of information. And Kirillov, the Russian general who was killed recently, he was in charge of collecting all this information about secret American bases and chemical weapons and biological research weapons, etc. So this was one. Then there were many joint military exercises with NATO troops. Then there were actual bases, the American military presence in Ukraine. This was also at the same time as there were anti-missile defense systems created in Poland, in Romania. Now, all of that actually leads up to a conclusion. The United States used all these years in order to make sure Russia would never rise again, that it would be kept in check by American supremacy, the overall supremacy as the American elites wanted. Now, then what happened as we get closer to 21 is that under President Trump, this process continued. Russian consulates were closed. America let expire the treaty limiting medium-range missiles. By the way, if the treaty had been in effect, then there would have been no Oreshnik. In other words, there wouldn't have been no intermediate range land missiles in Russia because they were banned. But now that the United States walked out, Russia has a full right to use those and have those. In other words, the process under first presidency of Trump continued. The process of containing Russia, of making sure that it would never rise again, of making sure that economically it would be of no competition. That was most American companies were ordered out of Russia, including oil companies. This was all before sanctions. This was simply a continuation of the neocon agenda that Trump continued, which means to keep Russia down. Now, finally, by the end of 2021, Putin had enough, and he made a declaration inviting the Western powers for an international treaty that would make sure that Ukraine would not be a member of NATO, to which Western countries, European as well as American, all answered no. This is Ukraine's sovereign right to defend itself and to essentially choose whichever security arrangement it wants. And in February 22, Zelensky, in his speech at the Security Council Security Conference in Munich, said that Ukraine was hoping to restore its nuclear weapons. Now, usually it is said that the United States warned everybody that Russia is going to attack, and this is how it came down in the official narrative. Russia attacked Ukraine. Now, that's all wrong, okay? So the way it really happened, my dear friends, is like this. In January 2021, there were massive shipments of American hardware, military hardware to Ukraine. There were serious preparations going on to reconquer the last 1/3 of Donbass, which remained independent. And it was in this context when intelligence services were telling to Putin they are going to attack, that Putin decided to strike first in order to preempt the inevitable seizure of the rest of Donbass by the Ukrainian forces, heavily armed by Western powers. Now, here's the most important point. At the beginning of this special military operation, the Western powers hoped that they will now put Russia in its place. It would be, the official policy was to render Russia a strategic defeat. So they hoped that militarily Ukraine would win and go and expel Russia from the Donbass and from Crimea. The plans were to impose control over Russian nuclear facilities, to create a regime change and overthrow Putin and put people friendly to the United States, some Western liberal types and oligarchs in power. Some plans actually presumed division of Russia into 5 republics that were under control, the European, the Siberian, etc., so that Russia would never pose any challenge to the United States. These were the plans of 2022. Now, it didn't work out this way. And we discussed in previous videos and other sources as to why. Very briefly, it didn't happen because from about, well, first of all, because Russia had an industrial base that Putin restored. This was this huge armaments industry and industrial base of the Soviet Union that lay dormant. And beginning from 2008, President Putin began to reactivate it, and there were programs of rearmament and restoration of industry. So Russia was no longer a kind of a put down, everything collapsed 1990s. By 2018 and 2021, it was already a much more viable industrial power. Now, the restoration of armaments industry, the very talented core of Russian engineers that stayed on and survived from the Soviet days, the elimination to a large extent of corruption and the power of oligarchs, all these reforms that I described in my last chapter of my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, which is in the description. I mean, this is very briefly, but essentially Russia turned out to be much stronger than anybody anticipated, including the Russian elites themselves. And so the result was that Russia not only withstood the offensive operation by Ukraine, totally armed by NATO, but in 2023, it withstood its so-called counteroffensive, and during 2024, it just continued its own offensive. And now we are at the turning point. And the question is not whether Russia would win. The question is when it will decide to stop. And if Trump offers a internationally guaranteed treaty that would guarantee security of the Russian Federation, then a remnant of Ukraine can still survive as an independent state. That is still possible, and I'm saying it on the 2nd of January 2025. If, however, the West chooses to continue its agenda of pushing Russia to strategic defeat, or refuses to recognize its victories at the front line with the Donbass and whichever other areas Russia chooses to be a part of the Russian Federation in the new borders of Ukraine, if they continue to insist they would no recognition, as some of the hardcore neocons recommend, then the Russian army would continue to advance all the way to Kiev and, if need be, all the way to Lvov. So Russia has won this war, my dear friends and listeners. This is the reality that Trump simply would have to recognize. The attempt to subvert Russia has failed. This is the major result of the 25-year rule of President Putin that has just occurred in December 2024. And on that note, thank you very much for your attention. Please subscribe to my channel and please buy my book, which all these events are covered in much greater detail, from Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in search of its identity. Thank you very much and goodbye.